The morning rain hammered against the Victorian windows of Manchester Crown Court, each droplet racing down the glass, like tears the building couldn't shed. Inside courtroom 3, Judge Margaret Thornton entered with her characteristic measured stride, black robes billowing behind her. At 62, her face bore sharp angles carved by years of suppressed compassion. "All rise," the clerk announced to an already standing room. She surveyed the packed gallery with steel-grey eyes that had witnessed 30 years of human failure. 15 years on the bench had earned her a reputation. The Iron Lady of Manchester. She knew the nickname. She wore it like armor. "Bring in the defendant," she commanded. Jamie Walsh entered in handcuffs. 19 years old, malnourished, wearing a borrowed suit that hung on his thin frame. Sandy brown hair fell across eyes, holding both defiance and defeat. Margaret's breath caught. Something about his jaw, his shoulders. She blinked hard, banishing a ghost trying to surface. "Mr. Walsh, you stand accused of breaking and entering, theft of goods valued at $8.47 from Tesco Metro. How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor." His voice was steady but hollow. Prosecutor Melissa Crawford stood. "Your Honor, the defendant smashed the store's back entrance and stole food items, baby formula, and children's medicine." "Baby formula?" Margaret interrupted, eyebrow arching. "Rather specific for a burglary." "The defendant has 2 younger siblings, Your Honor, 8 years and 18 months old. Their mother died of an overdose 6 weeks prior. He was their sole caregiver." Silence suffocated the room. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the one she'd learned to transform into something harder. "Where are these siblings now, Mr. Walsh?" "Foster care, Your Honor." His voice cracked. "They took them when I was arrested." Margaret's hidden hands trembled against her thighs. The ghost returned stronger. David's face, 30 years younger, wearing the same desperate love for siblings he couldn't save. "And you thought theft was the solution? You thought becoming a criminal would help keep your family together?" Jamie's eyes flashed. "I thought feeding them was the solution, Your Honor." A ripple went through the gallery. Margaret looked at Jamie and their eyes met. He saw through her armor to something beneath. It terrified her. Then she laughed, sharp, bitter, like glass breaking. The sound ricocheted off the walls, and everyone would remember it differently. To Jamie, it sounded like recognition. One broken person acknowledging another. "Do you know what I find fascinating about cases like yours?" she continued. "The predictability, addiction, poverty, crime. One generation poisoning the next. Your mother chose drugs over her children. Now you choose crime over legitimate help." "You don't know anything about my mother," Jamie said quietly. "I know she left 3 children to fend for themselves." "She was in pain." His voice cracked. "The NHS waiting list was 8 months. She couldn't wait that long." Margaret's composure flickered. Behind her eyes, another mother materialized, her own, bottles hidden in cupboards, the slow descent everyone saw but no one acknowledged. "Everyone's in pain, Mr. Walsh. The difference is how we handle it." "Easy to say from up there," Jamie shot back. "When did you last worry about choosing between electricity and food? When did you last hold a baby sister while she cried from hunger?" The courtroom gasped. Margaret's clerk reached for his gavel reflexively. "I've heard enough," Margaret said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Jamie Walsh, I sentence you to 12 months imprisonment." "Your Honor," his public defender rose desperately. "Given the circumstances—" "The circumstances," Margaret cut him off, "are precisely why Mr. Walsh needs to understand that society has rules, that suffering doesn't excuse law-breaking." She looked directly at Jamie. "That love, however pure its intentions, cannot justify crime." As the guards moved to take Jamie away, he turned back. "My brother and sister, they won't understand. They'll think I abandoned them too." Margaret's mask finally cracked, just for a second. "Then perhaps," she said, her voice catching almost imperceptibly, "you should have thought of that before." The courtroom began to empty, but BBC journalist Sarah Chen remained seated, scribbling furiously in her notebook. She'd been following Judge Thornton's cases for months, documenting the system's harsh treatment of poverty-related crimes. But today, she'd witnessed something different. That laugh hadn't been cruel. It had been the sound of someone recognizing their own pain in another's story. That night, Margaret stood before her bathroom mirror in her Cheshire townhouse, removing her makeup with mechanical precision. The face staring back looked older than this morning, or perhaps just more honest. Jamie Walsh's words echoed, "When did you last hold a baby sister?" while she cried from hunger. She had, 35 years ago. Before law school, before the armor, before she became someone who could sentence a desperate boy without flinching. Her phone buzzed. Timothy, her clerk, Judge Thornton, BBC journalist Sarah Chen has requested an interview about today's case. She says it's part of a documentary on justice system reform. Margaret typed back, "Absolutely not," but her fingers hesitated over send. Through her bedroom window, Manchester's lights twinkled in the distance. Somewhere out there, 2 children were crying for a brother who wouldn't come home, just like she once cried for David. Her younger brother who'd tried to keep them together after their mother's overdose, who'd stolen food when the benefits stopped, who'd been sentenced by a judge who laughed at his explanation, a sound that haunted Margaret through law school, through her career, until she became that very judge, that very laugh. She deleted her response and typed, "Tell Miss Chen I'll consider it." The next morning, Margaret arrived at court early, hoping to bury herself in case files. But Timothy intercepted her with an unusual expression. "Jamie Walsh attempted suicide in his cell last night," he said quietly. "He's in the infirmary, stable, but..." Margaret's coffee cup slipped, shattering on the marble floor. Brown liquid spread like blood across the white stone. "I need to see him," she heard herself say. "Your Honor, that's highly irregular. Everything about this case is irregular, Timothy." An hour later, she stood outside the prison infirmary, her hands trembling. Through the small window, she could see Jamie, bandages around his wrists, staring at nothing. A guard unlocked the door. "5 minutes," he warned. Jamie didn't look up when she entered. "Come to laugh some more, Your Honor." Margaret sat in the plastic chair beside his bed. For the first time in 15 years, she didn't know what to say. The armor she'd worn so long suddenly felt unbearably heavy. "My brother's name was David," she finally said. "He was 19 when he stole food for us, 20 when he died in prison." Jamie turned slowly, studying her face. "The judge laughed when David explained why he'd done it," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "Said he was just another sob story. I was 17. Old enough to remember every word, young enough to believe it was David's fault. I spent the next 30 years becoming someone who would never be that vulnerable again. Why are you telling me this? Because that laugh yesterday," her voice broke. "It wasn't at you. It was at myself, at the cosmic joke of becoming everything I once hated." Jamie's eyes filled with tears. "My siblings. I'm going to help them," Margaret said suddenly, surprising herself. "I don't know how yet, but I will." "Why would you do that?" She stood, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands. "Because someone should have helped David. Someone should have helped me. And maybe it's not too late to break the cycle." Sarah Chen sat in the BBC's Manchester office, replaying the courtroom audio for the 5th time. That laugh. There was something broken in it, something that spoke of pain transformed into power, compassion calcified into cruelty. Her editor, James, peered over her shoulder. "You really think the Iron Lady will agree to an interview?" he asked skeptically. "She already has," Sarah replied, showing him the email that had arrived that morning. "One condition, we interview Jamie Walsh too. The boy who attempted, he's recovering, and he's agreed to talk." 3 days later, Sarah's crew set up in a neutral location, a community center in Moss Side, the neighborhood where Jamie had lived. Margaret arrived first, looking smaller without her robes, wearing a simple grey suit that somehow made her seem more formidable. "Before we begin," Margaret said, "I need you to understand something. This isn't about rehabilitation of my image. It's about a system that creates judges like me and defendants like Jamie." Sarah nodded, adjusting her notes. The cameras rolled. "Judge Thornton, you've sentenced hundreds of people over your career. What made Jamie Walsh different? Margaret stared at the wall behind Sarah, where children's drawings were pinned, bright, hopeful splashes of color. He wasn't different. That's the point. He was exactly the same as a dozen cases I see every month. Poverty, desperation, crime, punishment. Repeat, she paused. But when I looked at him, I saw my brother David for the first time in 30 years. Your brother. He died in prison when I was 17. He'd been sentenced for theft, food for my younger sister and me after our mother died. The judge laughed at his explanation, called it another sob story. Sarah leaned forward. And yesterday you laughed. Yes. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. I became that judge. The one who could look at suffering and respond with scorn, because if you don't laugh, you might cry, and judges don't cry. The door opened. Jamie entered, escorted by a guard but uncuffed. His wrists were still bandaged, but his eyes were clearer. He sat across from Margaret, neither speaking for a long moment. You said you'd help my siblings, Jamie finally said. I've petitioned for emergency review of their foster placement. I've also reached out to a colleague who specializes in family law. We're exploring options for supervised custody once you're released. Why? His voice was raw. Margaret looked directly at him for the first time since he'd entered. Because the system failed you like it failed my brother, and I've been part of that system for too long. Sarah watched this exchange, recognizing she was witnessing something unprecedented. A judge and defendant meeting as equals, both broken by the same systemic failures. Jamie, Sarah said gently, can you tell us about that day in court? He shifted uncomfortably. When she laughed, I thought it was at me, at my pain. But looking back, it sounded like someone recognizing themselves in a mirror they'd been avoiding. And now, Jamie looked at Margaret. Now I see someone who built walls so high she forgot there were people on the other side. Real people, not just cases. Margaret flinched, but didn't look away. He's right. Each harsh sentence was another brick in those walls. Each dismissal of poverty as an excuse was me telling my 17-year-old self that David's death was justified. But it wasn't, Jamie said quietly. No, it wasn't. And neither is your suffering. The interview continued for 2 hours. Margaret spoke about the pressure on judges to be tough on crime, the way compassion was seen as weakness. Jamie talked about the impossible choices poverty forces: feed your siblings or follow the law, steal formula or let a baby go hungry. The laugh, Margaret said near the end, tears finally flowing freely, was the sound of my humanity, trying to break free. It came out wrong, twisted by years of suppression. But Jamie heard what it really was, a cry for help from someone who'd forgotten how to be human. The interview wouldn't air for 2 weeks, but word of Judge Thornton's breakdown spread through Manchester's legal community like wildfire. Some called for her resignation. Others, particularly younger lawyers who'd felt the weight of the system's callousness, saw it as long overdue honesty. Margaret returned to court the Monday after filming, but everything felt different. The robes felt like costume pieces, the bench like a stage where she'd been performing for 15 years. Her first case was another theft, a mother who'd stolen school uniforms for her children. The prosecutor presented the facts with the usual detachment. The woman stood in the dock, shoulders hunched, the same defeated posture Margaret had seen 1,000 times before. But now she saw more. The carefully mended holes in the woman's own clothes, the way she kept glancing at the gallery where her children sat, the tremor in her hands that spoke of skipped meals and sleepless nights. Mrs. Patterson, Margaret said, her voice gentler than anyone in the courtroom had heard before. Tell me about your children. The prosecutor looked confused. Your Honor, the facts of the case. The facts, Margaret interrupted. Tell us what happened. I'm asking why. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened. They're good kids, Your Honor, bright. The school said they couldn't attend without proper uniforms. I tried to get help, but the council said I earned too much for assistance, £15 a week too much. The uniforms cost £200. And their father left when the youngest was born. No child support. I work 2 jobs, but it's never enough. Margaret felt the courtroom's attention, the weight of expectation. The old Margaret would have given a lecture about lawful alternatives, handed down a fine the woman couldn't pay, perpetuated the cycle. But she wasn't that judge anymore. "Case dismissed," she said quietly. The prosecutor jumped up. "Your Honor, she's admitted guilt, and I'm exercising judicial discretion. Mrs. Patterson, there's a fund for families in need. My clerk will provide you with the information." She looked at Timothy, who nodded, understanding. This court recognizes that poverty is not a moral failing, and desperation is not criminal intent. That evening, Margaret found Jamie Walsh's siblings in a foster home in Salford. The foster mother, Mrs. Martinez, was kind, but overwhelmed. 7 children in a 3-bedroom house. 8-year-old Lily was trying to feed 18-month-old Thomas, her small hands shaking as she held the bottle. "You're not our mum," Lily said flatly when Margaret introduced herself. "No, I'm not. But I knew someone like your brother once. Someone who loved his sisters the way Jamie loves you." Lily's tough facade cracked. "Is Jamie okay?" "They won't tell us anything." Margaret knelt beside her, her expensive suit touching the worn carpet. "He's getting better, and he's going to come home to you. I'm going to make sure of it." "You're the judge who laughed," Lily said accusingly. "Jamie told me in his letter you laughed at him." Margaret felt each word like a physical blow. "Yes, I did. It was wrong. I was wrong." Why? How to explain decades of buried trauma to an 8-year-old? "Because I forgot that judges are people too, and people who are hurting sometimes hurt others." Thomas reached for Margaret, his chubby hands grasping. When she picked him up, he nestled against her shoulder with the trust only babies possess. She hadn't held a child since David's daughter. Her niece she'd never met would have been this age if David had lived to have children. "Will you really help us?" Lily asked, her voice small. "I'm going to try. I'm going to recommend early release for Jamie with community service, and I'm going to personally supervise his rehabilitation." Mrs. Martinez watched from the doorway. "In 30 years of fostering, I've never seen a judge visit the siblings. Why now?" Margaret adjusted Thomas in her arms, feeling his weight like an anchor to humanity she'd lost. "Because I spent 30 years punishing people for the crime of being poor. It's time I started making amends." That night, she began writing a letter to the Lord Chancellor, proposing reform to sentencing guidelines for poverty-related crimes. She knew it might end her career, but for the first time in decades, she slept without the weight of unacknowledged guilt. 2 weeks before the interview was set to air, Sarah Chen received a call that changed everything. It was from David Thornton, Margaret's brother David, very much alive, living in Glasgow under a different name. "I saw the promotional clips," he said, voice rough with emotion. "She thinks I'm dead. Our sister Emma told her I died in prison to protect me. I've wanted to contact her for 30 years, but Emma said Margaret had become everything we fought against. But seeing her now, breaking down, I need to see her." Sarah's hands shook as she took down his information. This would transform the documentary, but more importantly, it might save 2 siblings destroyed by the same system. She arranged to meet David first. He was 49 now, weathered but kind, working as a counselor for at-risk youth. The resemblance to Jamie Walsh was uncanny. The same sandy hair, the same determined jaw. "I did serve 6 months, David explained, but I survived. When I got out, Emma was 18. Margaret had started law school. Emma thought Margaret would throw away her future if she knew I was alive. An ex-convict brother would ruin her career prospects. So she told her I died. And you agreed to this? I was 20, broken, ashamed. I thought they were better off without me. By the time I realized the mistake, Margaret was already a prosecutor, already hardened. Emma said contacting her would destroy her. Emma died 5 years ago. Cancer. She made me promise to never tell Margaret, but seeing her with that boy, seeing her finally break," his voice cracked, "she became cruel because she thought cruelty killed me. What kind of brother lets his sister carry that?" Sarah made a decision that went against every journalistic instinct. "We're going to tell her before the interview airs. She deserves to hear it from you, not from television. 3 days later, Margaret sat in her chambers, reviewing Jamie's early release papers, when Timothy knocked. "There's someone here to see you, Judge. Says it's urgent." "I don't have any appointments." The door opened wider. A man stepped in, and Margaret's world tilted. The same eyes, the same nervous habit of running his hand through his hair. Older, lined, but unmistakably, "Hello, Maggie," the only person who'd ever called her that. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed into her chair. "You're dead," Emma said. "The prison called." "Emma lied to protect your career. She thought you'd throw everything away for an ex-convict brother." Margaret's breath came in gasps. 30 years. 30 years I've carried your death. 30 years I've punished others because I couldn't save you." David crossed the room, kneeling beside her chair. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She hit him then, weakly, fists against his chest like a child. "I became a monster because of you. Because losing you broke something in me that never healed. You became a judge who's finally remembering how to be human. I saw the interview clips. That laugh. I remember our mother laughing like that, when the pain was too much to cry." Margaret sobbed then, 30 years of grief pouring out in her chambers, where she'd sentenced hundreds to punishment she thought David had suffered. He held her, this ghost made flesh, while outside, Manchester's afternoon rain began to fall. "Jamie Walsh," she said finally. "He looks like you, acts like you, same desperate love for siblings." "I know. I've been watching the case. You're saving him, Maggie, the way no one saved me." "I'm trying to save myself," she admitted, "to become someone who deserves forgiveness." David pulled back, looking at her directly. "You already are. The woman who dismissed charges against that mother, who visits foster children, who admitted her wrongs on camera, that's not a monster. That's my sister finally coming home to herself." The night the interview aired, Margaret sat with David in her living room, the first time they'd been in the same room for a casual evening in 35 years. Jamie Walsh was there too, released that morning to her supervision, his siblings playing on the carpet with toys Margaret had bought in a shopping spree that felt like redemption. "You sure you want to watch this?" David asked. "I need to see who I became," Margaret replied, "and who I'm becoming." The documentary opened with the laugh, that sharp, broken sound echoing through the courtroom. Sarah Chen's voiceover began, "This is the sound of a system breaking down, not with revolution, but with recognition." On screen, Margaret watched herself transform from the Iron Lady to a weeping woman admitting her failures. Jamie's portions were interwoven, showing how poverty and desperation created criminals, how judges' assumptions perpetuated cycles. "Christ, Maggie," David whispered when she broke down on camera, admitting she'd become the judge who destroyed their family. But it was the final segment that broke everyone in the room. Sarah had filmed Jamie reuniting with his siblings at the foster home, then cut to Margaret's visit the same day. The parallel was clear, two people trying to save children from the system's failures. "Judge Thornton," Sarah's voice asked off-camera, "what would you tell your 17-year-old self watching her brother being sentenced?" Margaret on screen wiped her tears. "I'd tell her that justice without mercy isn't justice. It's revenge. That becoming hard doesn't protect you from pain. It just distributes it to others. And that one day she'll have the chance to save someone else's David. When that day comes, I'd tell her to choose love over law." The documentary ended with statistics about poverty-related crime, but in Margaret's living room, no one was watching anymore. Lily had crawled into Jamie's lap, Thomas was asleep against David's chest, and Margaret sat between the two men, feeling the weight of family for the first time in decades. Her phone buzzed continuously. Colleagues, journalists, officials. Tomorrow would bring consequences. There would be those calling for her resignation, others praising her courage. But tonight, she was just Maggie, a sister who'd found her brother, a woman who'd remembered how to feel. "You know this changes everything," David said quietly. "Your career, your reputation." "My career was built on a lie," Margaret replied. The lie that pain could be overcome by inflicting more pain, that suffering was a choice rather than a circumstance, that I could honor your memory by becoming someone you'd have hated. Jamie spoke up. You saved us, my family. We'd have been another statistic without you. We saved each other, Margaret corrected. You reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place, to help people like us, people the system fails. 6 months later, Margaret stood before Parliament's Justice Committee, proposing what had become known as the Walsh Reform, new sentencing guidelines for poverty-related crimes focusing on rehabilitation over punishment. Jamie sat in the gallery, wearing a suit that fit properly now, holding Thomas while Lily did homework beside him. The question, Margaret addressed the committee, isn't whether crime should have consequences. It's whether those consequences should perpetuate cycles of poverty or break them. Every Jamie Walsh we send to prison creates more children in foster care, more desperation, more crime. Lord Chancellor Harrison, who'd once been Margaret's mentor, leaned forward. Judge Thornton, you've had a dramatic change of heart. Some would say your personal involvement with the Walsh case compromises your objectivity. My lord, I spent 15 years being objective. Objectively cruel, objectively blind to circumstances. What compromised me wasn't involvement, it was detachment. When we stop seeing defendants as people with stories, families, struggles, we stop delivering justice and start perpetrating systemic violence. The room stirred. Several MPs who'd built careers on tough-on-crime rhetoric looked uncomfortable. Are you suggesting we excuse criminal behavior because of sob stories? MP Richards asked, his tone sharp. Margaret's jaw tightened, the old Margaret flashing briefly. I'm suggesting, Mr. Richards, that when a 19-year-old boy steals baby formula for his infant brother, we ask why formula isn't provided to orphaned children. When a mother steals school uniforms, we ask why education requires expensive clothing. When poverty drives crime, we address poverty, not just punish the poor. After 3 hours of testimony, Margaret emerged exhausted but determined. Jamie waited outside with the children and David, who'd moved to Manchester to be near his sister. How'd it go? David asked. They'll probably reject everything and call me too emotionally involved. But you tried, Jamie said. That matters. And later that evening, they gathered in Margaret's garden for dinner, a weekly tradition now. Sarah Chen joined them, working on a follow-up piece about the documentary's impact. Already, 3 judges had publicly supported Margaret's reforms, and several poverty advocacy groups had taken up the cause. You know what I realized, Margaret said, watching Lily help Thomas with his food. That laugh in the courtroom, it wasn't just recognition or pain. It was the sound of armor cracking. All these years I thought strength meant feeling nothing, but real strength is feeling everything and choosing compassion anyway. David raised his glass. To second chances. To broken systems admitting they're broken, Jamie added. To family, Lily said seriously, not fully understanding but knowing it was important. Margaret looked around the table. The brother she'd thought was dead, the young man she'd nearly destroyed, the children who'd brought her back to humanity. 6 months ago, she'd been the Iron Lady, untouchable and untouched. Now she was just Margaret, flawed and healing, surrounded by others doing the same. Her phone rang, the Lord Chancellor's office. She ignored it. Whatever consequences came tomorrow, tonight she had this. A family forged not by blood alone, but by shared recognition that everyone deserves mercy. Everyone deserves a chance to change. And sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. The sun set over Manchester, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In the distance, the Crown Court building stood against the skyline, unchanged, yet somehow different. It would open tomorrow to new cases, new struggles, new opportunities for justice or cruelty. But one judge would return different, carrying the knowledge that law without love was just organized vengeance, and that sometimes the most radical act of justice was simple human recognition. Jamie stood to clear the plates, Lily helping eagerly. David told stories of his work with youth in Glasgow. Thomas toddled between the adults, secure in the knowledge that he was loved and safe. And Margaret sat in the middle of it all, no longer the Iron Lady, but something more vulnerable and more powerful, a human being who'd remembered how to be human. The documentary had asked what makes someone laugh at another's pain. But the real question, Margaret now understood, was what makes them stop laughing and start healing. The answer sat around her table: connection, recognition, and the courage to admit that the system you've served might be the very thing that needs to be broken and rebuilt. As the evening grew late and the family dispersed to their respective homes, Jamie to his flat with the children, David to his nearby apartment, Margaret stood alone in her garden. But for the first time in 30 years, alone didn't feel lonely. It felt like potential, like the space before a new beginning. Tomorrow would bring challenges, criticism, possibly the end of her judicial career. But it would also bring the chance to fight for real justice, the kind that sees the human behind the crime, the story behind the statistics, the kind of justice David had deserved, the kind Jamie's siblings needed, the kind England's poor had been denied for too long. She looked up at the stars, barely visible through Manchester's light pollution, but there nonetheless. "I found him," she whispered to Emma, wherever she was. "I found David. I found myself. I finally found the way home."